representation here in Sweden and the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. It is my honor to welcome you to this very timely seminar about the EU's global role. With the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, the Vice President of the European Commission, Federica Mogherini. The High Representative will give an introductory remark for about 15 minutes, followed by questions and answers for about 30 minutes. But first, I would like to give the floor to the Swedish Foreign Minister, Margot Wallström.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, dear friends. Welcome here, and thank you to Björn. Today, I have the great pleasure to welcome the High Representative, Federica Mogherini, to Stockholm. And the European Union, I start from the beginning, that it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to this meeting, of course, and this mini seminar, or whatever to call it. And of course, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Federica Mogherini to Stockholm. The European Union is Sweden's most important foreign policy arena. And that's why I'm particularly glad to welcome Federica here today. As it happens, as of today, Federica and I are the only women in the Foreign Affairs Council. So our cooperation and our friendship is important to me. And I'm pleased also that a public event like this one is also part of your program while in Stockholm, Federica. Thank you for accepting that and doing that. The words and deeds of foreign ministers are certainly not enough, because we need to mobilize action much broader in society in order to promote peace, stability and security and development, and this is more evident in today's world than ever before. Federica and I have had important discussions today on a number of issues and challenges that we have to address together, and among them, not least, the grave situation in Syria that took almost most of this morning's discussions. Almost 4 years ago, Sweden was one of the initiators of the process that led to the European Global Strategy that was presented in July. And I very much, and we very much welcome the strategy, and I thank Federica for her very strong personal engagement in the work. The need for a strategic platform for the EU's foreign and security policy has never been clearer, and it is telling that the European Union security strategy from 2003 began with the words, "Europe has never been so prosperous, so secure, nor so free." It was a sign of the confidence broadly felt at that time. The European Global Strategy of today speaks of how to navigate this difficult, more connected, contested, and complex world, guided by our shared interests, principles, and priorities. The security situation in our immediate neighborhood has deteriorated rapidly in the east as well as in the south. And Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and its aggression against Ukraine has cost nearly 10,000 lives and continues as we speak. And that is why the European Union's dialogue with Russia must be clear and principled, and our support to Ukraine strong. And the EU's support to countries of the Eastern Partnership is key to their development into resilient and democratic societies. And this is something that we always will support, to keep it on the agenda. And this is also one thing we discussed today and appreciate that we get the support for. The situation on the EU southern border, the attempted coup in Turkey, and the ongoing war in Syria, and a continued refugee crisis also require joint action. The EU must continue to promote peace, security and development, while at the same time upholding democracy, rule of law, and human rights. So the EU global strategy has a strong commitment to values and a rules-based global order, as well as a broad-based approach to using all the instruments available in external policies. Now we have to ensure that the vision of the strategy is followed up by common action, and Sweden is fully committed to do its part. During our meeting today, we also discussed how to strengthen cooperation between the European Union and the United Nations, and we have insisted on saying that we will be the European Union's best friend in the UN and the UN's best friend, and the opposite is also true, and that's how we intend to plan also our work, of course, in the Security Council. We are observers from the 1st of October, and will actually also be in the chair for January month, and that means also introducing a new Secretary General, somebody that has been a commissioner in the European Union. And how the EU can contribute further also to the UN's fundamental vision of maintaining international peace and security. So I'm looking forward, as I'm sure you are, to hear Federica speak on EU's global role and to also listen to an interesting discussion here today. So once again, a warm welcome to all of you. Happy to see many ambassadors and also representatives of civil society and journalists in the room, Federica. So you will have a very qualified audience listening to you. So the floor is yours, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Margot. Is this on? You hear me? Yes, good. Thank you very much. I cannot hear myself very much. I apologize in advance. I have a bit of flu, so I might be less reactive than normal. Should make it anyway, but in case it doesn't, I ask for your understanding. Well, first of all, thank you, Margot. Thank you very much for organizing this. This is really something quite special for me, because Sweden has been, from the very beginning, as Margot was saying, a strong promoter of the need for a new global strategy for the European Union. Many member states contributed in many different ways, but Sweden has contributed in a special way because it forged, I would say, the spirit of the strategy. Because in the very beginning we were thinking if we needed a new security strategy, and in the beginning we listened to the Swedish approach that seemed very reasonable and wise to me, looking beyond the traditional security sphere, recognizing that we have to discuss and work, first of all, on the human security, which goes from societal resilience to climate change, to natural disasters, to conflict prevention, to human rights, women empowerment, and that a purely security angle was not enough in our times. So, first of all, this strategy is very much in nature, in the scope of it, global not only geographically but also thematically. It looks at all the issues that are relevant for our common interests and our common values in the European Union. And this is thanks to a Swedish proposal, to a Swedish approach to our strategy. So thank you for putting us on the right track from the very beginning. Second, the way in which we worked on the strategy was very much beyond governments only. Obviously, we had to develop full ownership of member states, governments across the government spectrum, so not only the foreign ministries, but also defense, development cooperation, trade, but also environment or other portfolios. But it was from the very beginning clear to me that we had to look beyond the government and look at national parliaments, local authorities, civil society, universities, think tanks, what I call the foreign and security policy community in the European Union. And that is very strong in all our corners of our continent. And my expectation is that this method of keeping a strong involvement of our communities beyond institutions, beyond national institutions, will be kept as we work on the implementation of the strategy. So this is somehow one of the first occasions we have to exchange on the implementation of our strategy with this lively and vibrant community we have. And in Sweden in particular, I see many friends in the room. So I know that I will have a challenging hour in front of me in terms of exchanges and questions, but also a lot of notes to take for our work when we go back to Brussels. Let me start by saying that very often you hear our citizens or our partners referring to the need to have a strong European Union as a strong global actor. Now, I have the impression that this expectation is sometimes stronger outside of our borders than inside of our borders. I give you a couple of examples. Just last week, yes, Friday, so a few days ago, the Nobel Peace Prize to a president that invested all his political career in the last, and his political capital in the last years to peace in Colombia. It is very well known that he got the Nobel Peace Prize, but it is maybe less known that the European Union has worked with him hand in hand since the very beginning of this process. Every single week, I would say, we were in contact at different levels to see how the European Union could practically accompany the negotiations, make sure that a peace agreement could be then implemented in a successful way, providing the political support, the logistical support, the funding support in most cases, but also the diplomatic atmosphere around it. And this is something that, for instance, in Colombia is very widely recognized. Do our European citizens know about this? Do they recognize the same kind of global role that if you go now to Colombia and ask the Colombian citizens, you get it clearly. Yes, the European Union is a global actor. Not sure about that. A second example. Margot will remember in July, we had for the first time ever a US Secretary of State participating to our Foreign Affairs Council. To me, it was a surprise, if not a shock, to know that never before a US Secretary of State was participating to a Foreign Affairs Council of the European Union. Still, it was the case. John Kerry came to Brussels, I think, 4 or 5 times since then. So only in a few months, he was visiting officially the European institutions several times. And the last time, it was just last week. Plenty of things happened last week. And he delivered a very powerful speech. I would suggest all of you to have a look at that. It was the German Marshall Fund. And he concluded the speech saying, I quote, "Europe needs to believe in itself as much as we believe in you." I would print this sentence very big and put it on all our official buildings and possibly also in the streets somewhere in our cities. Because sometimes, in London, but also in many other capitals and beyond the capital cities. Because my impression is that sometimes our friends around the world see our potential, see our strength much more than we do ourselves. And the basic rule of strength, that is not a bad thing, depends on how you use it, is that if you're not aware of your strengths, you don't use it. And then it becomes useless instead of useful. So my purpose with the global strategy, in having the process going, in having the document now and then on the implementation, is somehow putting a mirror in front of us and trying to make us all realize the huge potential we have in our hands and that sometimes we don't use. The Lisbon treaties give us enormous powers, a huge number of tools that we don't always use at full because of lack of political will, lack of self-confidence in ourselves, sometimes the two combined. Sometimes you don't go towards a certain decision because you expect the political unity not to be there. Well, obviously, if you don't try, you don't get there. So the purpose of the strategy was exactly this, the combination of, one, making the common European interest emerge in the field of foreign and security policy, and second, make us Europeans aware of which kind of tools we have and which kind of tools we can use to fulfill our goals and our objectives. So somehow achieving our potential as Europeans together. Together, underlying the added value of being together. Today I was just meeting the Prime Minister a few moments ago, and he was telling me, you know, when Sweden joined the European Union, the support for the European Union was lower than today. Perfect, ideal. This means that there has been a work to show that Sweden has something to gain from being part of a bigger family. And I think this is exactly the key, especially in foreign and security policy. There is not one single country in our European Union alone that in the world of today, complex, difficult, violent, confrontational, not one single of our European countries alone can influence the international and global agenda, while we can do it if together. Because sometimes we don't realize, but we are already a superpower as a European Union. Now, every time I say superpower connected with European Union, I see plenty of skeptical faces. But you look at the numbers, and we are the first economy in the world. We are the biggest market in the world. We are the biggest provider of foreign investment in the world. We are the biggest humanitarian aid provider, and we are the biggest development cooperation provider in the world. And here Sweden has something to teach us. And I could continue. We have, with our network of diplomatic presence in the world, combined European Union offices plus all our embassies combined, we are the most connected diplomatic network in the world. And this showed very clearly when we managed to mobilize consensus around the climate change agreement. That was finally ratified also by us just last week. Again, last week, plenty of things happened. So this is showing us the huge potential of the European Union instruments when we really use them and when we believe we have the possibility to use them for good purposes. And the global strategy is aimed exactly at this, making full use of our potential, realizing that it can serve the citizens' interests at best. I always feel very bad when I see that there is any distance put between the national capitals and Brussels. I always say, as a joke, the only ones that cannot do it are the Belgians. Apart from that, all of us can say Stockholm against Brussels, Rome against Brussels, London against Brussels, Paris against Brussels, Lisbon, and I could go on. The Belgians cannot do this game, but in terms of politics, obviously they also can. This to say that in the global strategy, it emerges quite heavily, quite strongly, that the best and only maybe way of serving our interests, our citizens' interests, when it comes to security, when it comes to migration, when it comes to energy, when it comes to, you name it, trade, the best, if not the only way of serving these interests is through the European Union. Much better than through purely national approaches. The point is making the Union work at its best to serve these common interests. And here we need to join up our works. So we have started now, having achieved the strategy, the implementation work. We've started it over the summer. We've had several discussions. Large part of my meetings today with Margot, with the ministers today, has been focused on this. Where we start the implementation, which are the priorities, and this is also what I'm going to discuss with the members of parliament today, because I am convinced that national parliaments have to play a role also in the implementation phase of this strategy. Now, I know that the defense part of the strategy is the one that attracts the most of the public attention. Maybe it's because Europe is always perceived as a soft power, while we actually have also some degree of hard power. Very few people know that we have already, as European Union, 17 between civilian and military operations around the world, serving peace. as the United Nations have peacekeeping operations, we also have operations that, in most of the cases, cooperate with the UN missions on the ground. Actually, the UN is our first partner on the ground everywhere. So we do have some hard power already, but maybe there is something else we can do at the service of our diplomatic work, at the service of our humanitarian work, at the service of our development work. And by the way, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goal, you have the Sustainable Development Goal number 16 that tells very clearly that there is no development without security and no security without development, and that asks us, from us, more work on providing security. Also because a purely civilian power will need to rely on someone else's hard power in order to have access, for instance, to certain areas. But so I understand there is potential for more work to be done on the security and defense cooperation inside the European Union. I understand there is a lot of attention to that. But I know I share with most of you, if not all of you here in this room, the need to avoid that our work on implementation of the global strategy on defense does not overshadow our work on all the other sectors, which are maybe even more important than the one on defense and security. Because the core business of the European Union is what we call the integrated approach, or the comprehensive approach, and this is what works best. And this is also where we have our biggest assets. Only the European Union can mix and match trade policies, environmental policies, aid, development, but also some sort of security work. So the work on the implementation of the strategy will start from one point that goes across the strategy in a very powerful way, which is working to build resilience of countries and societies around us. It's something we would need also inside the European Union, but this is beyond the scope of my institutional mandate. But when we say in the strategy, building resilience, this touches really all fields of our action, because we don't only mean resilience of institutions, we mean resilience of societies. There is no resilient institution if not based on strong, open, resilient societies. And when you touch this, you touch indeed the issue of good governance, access to resources, human rights, women empowerment, job for young people, good education, and you could continue. So this is going to be the first field of implementation of the strategy. How do we concretely, with clear deliverables, work in building and encouraging resilience in societies and institutions all around our region? Second is the integrated approach to conflicts and crises. This is something, again, that only the European Union has to this extent. We are the only ones that have the tools to intervene from the early warning to the conflict prevention, to the crisis management, to the post-conflict reconstruction and stabilization, and to make sure that after the acute crisis, it doesn't come again, a new crisis in a couple of years' time, because all the crises we're facing in this moment around us are either something we could easily foresee 10 years ago, or things that are coming up again after having been up and down for quite some years. Think of Iraq, think of Libya, and I could continue. So this is not only a good thing to do, it's also a smart thing to do. It's investing in something that brings a sustainable security, if you allow me to use this term. And here again, and then I'll close, I have a good example of something that happened last week. Be sure also other things happened the week before and 2 weeks before, but last week was particularly intense, as every week. Last week we hosted in Brussels an Afghanistan conference, when we remobilized again the international donors community to support Afghanistan. And that conference started with two events that to me were even more important than the conference officially. And that were, one, the meeting on women empowerment in Afghanistan, where the First Lady herself was passing the strong message that, and the President as well, as long as women are not fully empowered in the country, the entire country will not stand up to its own potential. And second, a meeting with civil society organizations, both inside Afghanistan and in the international community. Now, the work we do with civil society inside the country and outside the country, the work we do with women inside the country, also outside the country, but in particular there, the work we do to support economic development, to support job creation, to support resilience of societies, is what I think is European foreign and security policy at its best. We didn't do only that. We did only something that is purely diplomatic, meaning we managed to gather, this was quite unnoticed media-wise, but I think it was quite something. We managed to gather the evening before the conference at ministerial level, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, China, together with Ban Ki-moon, John Kerry, and obviously ourselves, to see if around that regional compact, some support for talks on reconciliation in Afghanistan could restart. And it was just a few days after India and Pakistan were, let's say, in a rather confrontational mode among themselves. Still, they managed to come at the European table to discuss about something that was of common interest, trying to relaunch a peace and reconciliation process in Afghanistan. Now, I notice more and more that the European Union can provide that space, can provide this open space for quiet mediation and negotiation, looking for the common ground, looking for the win-win approach in conflicts and crises that are otherwise difficult to solve. Looking at different levels of need of intervention, the local, the regional, and the global. Now, let me conclude with one word on Syria, even if I'm sure that we will go back to that in our Q&A session. I was, I think, as many of you in this room, very saddened with what happened in the Security Council in this couple of days. Because we saw not only a very dire situation on the ground, a dramatic situation from a humanitarian point of view and a military point of view in Aleppo, but also we saw the potential breakdown of the multilateral mechanism by definition, the Security Council. I believe that it will be vital for us to work together, as Margot was saying, as the best friends of the United Nations, to restore the space for the United Nations to play its role in the many crises we have around us. And I'm sure that with Sweden in the Security Council, with the new Secretary General taking up its role, we will, as Europeans, invest in creating this strong multilateral player that the United Nations have to be, to move from a confrontational to a cooperational approach in the crisis around us. Because this is the common feature we see all over the crises that are around us. That we too often go on the zero-sum game approach, the confrontational approach, where at the end of the day, nobody wins and everybody loses, especially the civilians. While we've seen it with the Iran deal last year, it is possible, even in the most difficult circumstances, even after 13 years in that case of negotiations, find one tiny space of common ground that can then be expanded as much as it is sufficient to find an agreement that satisfies all. So I believe that on Syria, we will need to find a way, as European Union, together with our friends in the UN, find a way of rebuilding the path to a political solution. You know, we always said in the European Union that there is no military solution to the war in Syria. There can be a military victory against Daesh, and probably there has to be, but there cannot be a military solution to the conflict in Syria, which is a different thing. It's an overlapping issue. If we really mean it, and I think we do, then we cannot accept that the voice is only for the arms on the ground. And we cannot accept that we give up any diplomatic space to be explored. And this is what we discussed with Margot today. This is what we will discuss with the foreign ministers on Monday, trying to stubbornly open small spaces, little ways that can lead to some political solution, locally, regionally, and at the global level. So, let me close by thanking you. I was, as always, longer than expected and longer than needed. But I thank you very much for, first of all, for the invitation, for arranging this. That is, for me, very important, not only to get questions, but also to get suggestions. I would be really honored to also hear your views on how we can improve our foreign and security policy, how we can better implement our strategy, as we start doing that, obviously ready to answer also your questions, but also ready to take notes of your suggestions and comments. I thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and I think you've inspired to several questions. And while the audience thinks about their questions, anyways, just raise your hand when you have a question. I will go first while you're thinking. The new EU global strategy states that Russia's actions in our neighborhood have challenged the European security order at its core. And the EU has replied with a rather strong sanctions regime. But as our joint capacity for action increases, so also increases the incentives for external actors to try to deal directly with European nations and to support splinter groups in Europe. I wonder, considering this, do you feel that we have sufficient tools and geopolitical consensus in order to manage this Russian challenge to the European security order?
Yes. Easy.
Good.
No, it's not that easy, but yes, I think we do. I think generally we do have much more leverage and many more tools than what we realize we have. For instance, take the entire work we've done on sanctions since 2 years now, a bit more. I always face the question, by the media in particular, Europe is divided on Russia. Really? It's 2 years we have decided together to introduce sanctions on the basis of a clear legal basis and on the basis of a clear political perspective, that of lifting the sanctions as long as the Minsk agreement will be, or as soon as the Minsk agreements will be implemented. And we've kept them, always in unity, with different points of view among member states, but with a final decision. And I always say, to measure the unity of the European Union, don't measure the statements that the ministers do at the doorstep entering the Council, because that reflects the difference of background we have, which is our richness. That is what makes us great. The fact that we have different histories, different geographies, different points of view, different understandings of the situation. This is what makes us unique. But look at the common decisions after we finish the councils. There is always a strong common ground, including on Russia, where we just decided in March this year to have a common approach that includes, for instance, keeping the sanctions as long as the Minsk agreements will not be implemented, but also selective engagement with Russia in the fields where we see an interest from the European Union side to do so. So I'm convinced that we have the unity. I'm convinced we have the leverage. I'm convinced we also have the right approach, which is also the dialogue open. I have contacts with Minister Lavrov that are very frequent, very open, very candid, not always easy, but always constructive. And I think this is the European way. You talk to everybody. I guess it's also the Swedish way. You talk to everybody, especially if you have a problem, you talk to everybody. So yes, I believe that this mix we have of principled, as Margot was mentioning, principled approach, united approach, with some leverage, but also with an open mind, looking not at the instruments in themselves, but at the aim, at the political objective, makes us possibly going in the right direction. Sanctions are not an instrument in itself, are not an end in itself. They are a tool to achieve a change in policy. I think that we have the wisdom to focus on the change in policy that is needed rather than on the instruments themselves. And so, yes, I'm confident that we have that unity, leverage, and also strategic, you mentioned space.
Geopolitical consensus.
Geopolitical consensus. Good definition, yes.
Excellent. Okay, questions. Please raise your hands and introduce yourself, and please be brief. Yes, here.
First of all, may I say that I'm very happy to see you because I had the honor and the pleasure to welcome you as Minister of Foreign Affairs of Italy in, it was what, 2014?
It was 2 years ago, yes.
Yes, 2 years ago. And I think as Ambassador of Italy I have a duty, and my duty is to remember to all of us that maybe there is the problem of migration that is part, of course, of the European global strategy, where with the adoption of the agenda on migration, the Commission did so much, and then we had the Italian presidency, and the progress was sensible, was evident. And now we all know there are different sensitivities in Europe. It is not always to find the synthesis, but I'm very happy to raise here in Stockholm because I know how Sweden and Italy are like-minded on this issue. And it would be nice to have a bit an idea of the deadline, the next deadline, what we can expect, which progress we can expect. And with the reference to the defense, European defense, I just would like to stress one aspect. Maybe you can explain, I have the impression that the key is how to reconcile the ambition with the inclusiveness. How to have a step ahead in the integration for the states who would like to do that, and at the same time reassure the states that maybe now have a different sensitivity, as I think Sweden is. Thank you.
Thanks.
Please have a go.
Thanks for raising migration instead of me. As an Italian, I'm only pleased. No, but indeed, this is a file where, well, you remember that very well. During the Italian presidency, was somehow inaugurated a new approach, putting for the first time ever this issue on the agenda of foreign and interior ministers together. I was shocked. Out of many things, as I started this job, not only that a US Secretary of State had never been invited to the Foreign Affairs Council, but also that the Foreign Affairs Council had never had migration on its agenda before. It was only for interior ministers, while it is quite self-evident that migration is something that is originated outside of our borders. So tackling it only on an internal angle is clearly short-sighted. So we started 2 years ago a process. We've gone a long way. My sorrow is that it took us so many deaths in the Mediterranean to wake up to the reality that this was a European issue and not only an issue for the frontline member states. And where are we now? Now we are for sure in a better place than 2 years ago. We have on the external side of our migration policies three main issues that I believe will determine a complete change of approach. It's turning the page and starting an investment. First, the partnerships with the countries of origin, with developing migration compacts with countries of origin and transit in a partnership approach, meaning that we have a common challenge, managing a very complex phenomenon. How do we do it better? On their side, on our side, how can we help each other? Creating job opportunities, creating border management efficiency and things like that. Second element of which I'm proud is that in the same spirit, we launched a huge external investment plan, mobilizing up to 44 billion euros of only EU budget money. If member states join, can go up to 88. And that is the long-term investment we need to create development, sustainable developments in the societies and in the countries, in the communities where most of the migration flows come from. And this is the real long-term answer. It's basically implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. Third, a serious work on dismantling the traffickers' network. I think too little attention has been paid so far to this aspect. Having a certain background, I understand the reason why. But if you go to, well, being an Italian ambassador here, being myself an Italian, if you go to Lampedusa, or if you go to any place where you can talk to migrants, you hear stories that you would never want to hear. Stories of women in chains, raped every day, stories of minors that maybe left their villages with plenty of hopes, with all the money of their extended family paid for a journey of hope that turned into a nightmare. Is this the human mobility we want for our century? So to me, dismantling the smugglers and the traffickers' networks is part of our humanitarian work, because we cannot accept that human mobility happens this way. And finally, we have in the Mediterranean not only the Italian Navy, but we have a European Union operation with 24 member states under the EU flag arresting the smugglers and seizing the vessels. It's enough? No, it's never enough. We're also saving people. But every single person that dies at sea or in the desert, which is a bit far away and we don't see it, but there's plenty of people dying in the desert before they reach Libya. This is unacceptable for any European, I think. So the point is this: dismantling the traffickers' networks. We are working also with our partners, especially in Niger, to do that effectively. Saving lives, priority number one for me as a human being. Opening also regular channels, because Europe needs migration. It's something that most of our citizens don't like to hear, but if you look at our economy, that's a simple truth. I would like to promote a study on the costs of non-migration. That would be enormous for our societies. Probably not the most popular thing to do for European institutions at this time, but it's true that parts of our economies and of our demographies need migration, but an orderly, regular, controlled, safe migration. There is one aspect on which I'm less positive, which is the internal aspect of our agenda, because as you recalled, the Commission adopted an agenda on migration that foresees relocations. Far from that, I know that Sweden here has a clear position as well. I believe personally that, well, institutionally, I believe that once the European bodies, and especially the European Council, takes a decision, it's a matter of coherence to apply that decision and implement that decision. But apart from that, I believe that it's a simple matter of mutual solidarity, that we need to help each other. Sweden has experienced a huge number of migrants and refugees last year. The year before, maybe it was not Sweden, it was another country. And maybe next year, it's going to be another country that today has almost zero. If you're part of a family, you help each other. It's basic common sense, and we are part of a family. So I really hope that at a certain moment, our political leaderships across the European member states will realize that, as we say, around the Mediterranean, we are on the same boat. And that if one faces a problem, all of us face a problem, and we have to help each other. Again, it's common sense, it's pure common sense, but it's also a matter of common interest. Because I'll stop here, sorry, but the issue of migration is obviously very relevant for me, and it's also one thing on which we have worked a lot in the last 2 years. It's also common interest, because if one of our member states is facing a major problem, also the others are. You might live out of the illusion that you can take this away, but it is a short-term illusion. We are one, and we are part of the same union. So I believe that here we have still a bit of work to do, but I'm encouraged on the other side that on the UN side, on the global level, we have finally come up with this global compact, and thanks again for Sweden's contribution to that, that both on refugees and on migrants, we have now on a global level more awareness that we need to share.
Thank you. We take 2 questions. We have one there, mid-row.
Thank you very much. I'm Niklas Bremer from the Department of Government in Uppsala University. I think I'd like to tag on to the last question that the Italian ambassador posed to you. Considering that we have seen substantial progress in terms of security cooperation lately in Europe, but we perhaps haven't seen substantial progress when it comes to integration in security and defense. We've seen real-world developments pushing member states to cooperate on numerous security threats, terrorism, for instance. We've seen the strategic development that you've been mentioning here today on the EU global strategy. And we have perhaps also a sense of urgency to these questions now that the UK seems to be on the verge of leaving the EU, opening up new.
On this, I will be short, which doesn't mean that our work is little. First of all, and anywhere. This is also true in that case, but I think this is more than that. This is a general approach we try to develop. Being the European Union foreign policy, and this is no exception. On security and defense, first of all, I'm not among those that thinks that when the UK will leave the European Union, which has not happened yet, and also security and defense, in case through NATO, because EU and NATO have, as you know, strong partnerships that are getting even stronger. So it's not about now, it's because our citizens have clear in mind that this is a field where alone member states can achieve less than United States. Can be extremely helpful for all European citizens, and that is the work on capabilities development. In particular, the support the European institutions can provide. I know it's a little bit less sexy than big political scenarios, but it's very concrete, and it's also good for the economy, by the way. The concrete support that the European Union can provide to the industrial base of our security and defense sector. I always quote one figure that is quite amazing. The European Union member states in total spend half of the budget that the United States spent on defense, so 50%, but our output is 15%, 1-5. So we always refer to the need to increase the defense budget. First of all, let's look at the output, and let's look at how we can make the most out of the money we are already investing. And this is sometimes very much related to the economy of scale. And again, here, the European Union can provide an interesting field for research, technology, innovation, but also the industrial basis. Then there are a number of other issues that could be covered. The treaties of Lisbon provide us with a number of tools in the field of security and defense that were never used, from the permanent structured cooperation to Article 44, others. I mean, I don't enter into boring details, but it's like if we had 2 waves. The first one it was in the 50s, when the founding fathers and mothers of the European Union were foreseeing to have a European defense chapter next to the economic one, and that failed. We know very well why. Then in the Lisbon Treaties, there are provisions that would strengthen the defense part of the European Union. That was exactly in the midst of the economic and financial crisis in Europe, and that part went a bit unnoticed. Maybe now, with the large attention we have to security and the need to complement our soft power with some elements of hard power, always at the service of our comprehensive approach, so as an integral part of our policies that will always be aimed at building peace and preventing conflicts. Maybe now there is a possibility, a political window, to use the instruments we have in a smart way, again, without turning in any possible way the European Union either into a military alliance or in a fortified militaristic approach. Not at all. But it's simply a matter that in some cases you need to have also some hard power to pursue your policy goals, which again, as I said, are also always aimed at the search for peace.
Thank you. We have time for two very brief questions. One here, Hans Blixt, Dennis Peters at the end. Very brief.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure to see you again, Ms. Mogherini, in Stockholm. I have two brief points and one question. The first point relates to the deal reached with Iran about the nuclear program. The European Union played an important role all the way through, and you personally did so, and you still have a very important role to play in that, because Europe's attitude is not exactly the same as that of the United States. And in particular, I think we are more eager than at least part of the public opinion in the US that this agreement does not break down. It's fundamentally important for the region. The second point is to support you in the position that the European Union is indispensable for us all, that does things that we cannot do ourselves. There's a lot of complaints that the European doesn't do enough for us. However, I think we could look at the agreement with Turkey about the immigration. Now, the agreement is criticized in part for some and for understandable reasons. However, it is an agreement that could not have been reached by each and every one of us in Europe. It was necessary that the European Union do it. Now I come to the question, and that relates to the Ukraine. The Ukraine has many problematic problems in it, strategic and military and so forth. But there's one aspect not talked about very much that deals directly with the Union, and that is the association agreement reached under which the goods from the European Union will pass duty-free through Ukraine and to Russia, and vice versa. So there is need for some mechanism to reconcile the Ukrainian economic and customs relations with Russia on the one hand, and the customs relations they will have under the association agreement with Europe. My question is there any progress on that, or are the discussions going on to solve it? Because it is not a matter that is not insignificant. Thank you.
Do we have a question in the
Oh, yeah. I have a question as to the relationship between UN and the EU, and what prospects do you see on an increased relationship between and cooperation between the EU and the UN, especially now considering that we soon have a new Secretary General and new European members of the Security Council?
Yes, I'll start with that. EU and UN, to me, and Margot knows that very well, it's not thinkable to work separately. If you look at Syria, if you look at Libya, if you look at Africa, if you look at disarmament and non-proliferation, if you look at development, you name it, we all work together, always, in every single of these files. And in some cases, the European Union work is aimed at supporting the UN Special Envoy work. Sometimes I even get criticized for that, but I really believe that it's an interest for the European Union to support the UN mechanisms to work in the best possible way, because I know well that it's true for the UN what it's true also for the European Union, which means that the UN can function if their stakeholders make it function. The EU functions if its member states make it function. So if we want the UN to succeed, we have to invest in the UN to succeed, to give them. So relations are more than excellent. We work hand in hand on everything. The new Secretary General will have a huge challenge in front of him. a Security Council profoundly divided, polarized, an organization that needs profound reforms. But I know Antonio Guterres for a long time, really, really long, and I will always remember some things that he told me just after finishing his mandate in Portugal. So we know each other really since a long time. And he told me, you know, Federica, I realized only when I left power that there is a big difference between being in power and using power. And you have to make sure that whenever you have a situation where you are in power, you make use of it, because then it doesn't come back again. And there are so many things you can regret. And I think that he will keep this in mind as he enters this new function. And I think he has the heart, the vision, the experience, the wisdom to use the UN and to reform the UN to the extent the world needs it, because never as before we need a strong multilateral actor as the UN to be strong and effective. And he will count on us. We will be there in connection with our member states in the Security Council. I am 100% sure that this will be a good story. We have Sweden there. We will have obviously the 2 permanent members. We have another interesting thing, 2 member states sharing a seat for 2 years. This might lead me to a certain moment to ask the question to the ministers if you don't want to coordinate before rather than after having candidatures, but this is up to member states' sovereign choice. It seems to me that there might be some interest and space for doing that in a reasonable way, but this is another story. On Ukraine, yes, we have 2 mechanisms that are in place for facilitation that are also foreseen by the Minsk agreements. Trilateral energy talks that are still somehow going on, somehow. The somehow can be elaborated more, and the work on trade, both difficult but both useful. So again, maybe not for a public meeting, but this is for sure something where the European Union role can play as a facilitator rather than as an element for polarization. And on Iran. Indeed, we do have a special role to play. First, I am, and no one knows that better than you, I am really proud because, you know, last year, before we reached the agreement, everybody was very skeptical and said this deal would never be achieved. And indeed, it took a lot of time, but we made it. Then after we signed the agreement, everybody was saying, yes, but it will never be implemented. And after 6 months, we had the implementation day. And even then, 16th of January, I remember that very well, everybody was saying, yes, but you will see, it will never stick. It will never continue to be implemented. And we have now 3 IAEA reports saying that Iran is implementing it full. So it's holding. We have a special role to play. I have a personal special role to play because I still chair the Joint Commission supervising the implementation of the agreement. I chaired the last ministerial just in New York during the General Assembly, where we shared the assessment that the deal is implemented. And we have, as Europeans, a special role to play for 2 reasons, and then I stop, I promise. One is that this agreement is is only a nuclear, well, I cannot say that to you, but it's only a nuclear agreement. But it has the potential to open up the country. And this is the real political investment. That a political leadership in Iran has chosen the way of engagement with the international community. Now, we have the interest in making this work, not only for the nuclear part of the deal, which is still relevant to Europeans because we are in the region. So if Iran develops a nuclear bomb, it's our problem, first of all. But also because the international engagement of Iran can open the way for, obviously, economic opportunities for Europeans, social opportunities for Iranians, and foreign policy opportunities for the region. And I believe that this is going to be something we will need to explore more when it comes to Syria, because I'm convinced that the keys to the possible diplomatic work on the Syrian crisis lies in the region much more than we have explored so far. And here there can be a role for the European Union to play.
Well, Federica Mogherini, you've been most generous with your time and with your thoughts. Thank you very much for coming here to Stockholm and discussing these issues. Please join me in applaud.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.